So the first speaker, Winston Yan. Winston is a physician scientist and genome engineer motivated by using genetic medicine to treat patients, particularly those with a rare disease. He is the founding president of the N=1 Collaborative, co-founded by Julia and Tim, and co-founder and head of translational strategy at Arbor Biotechnologies, working in both biotech and academia nonprofit settings to enable new treatments. Winston completed his MD from Harvard Medical School and Ph.D. from Harvard University, working with Feng Zhang at the Broad Institute on early CRISPR genome editing technology development. Without further ado, Winston, you can start sharing your screen.
Fantastic. All right, thanks so much. I honestly really wish I were in sunny, San Diego with you guys. My hands are freezing literally right now as I'm sitting at my desk presenting this to you. So I'm going to change gears a little bit from what we've talked about so far. And the gear change is that after all of the data that you've seen from Jean, Don, after the stories you've heard from Julia and Amber and Michelle, like it's really now thinking about how do we put it all together and how can we continue to scale this work to move into that long tail of ultra rare disease. So this is not a data-driven talk. This is more conceptual and more about thinking about how we can work collaboratively to make this all happen. So the title of my talk is Individualized Medicines Need Collective Learning. We heard a lot about these ASOs and what types of technologies they can, or what types of treatments at the both N of many as well as N of few level they can enable. But the key is now, as a platform technology, how do we translate that learning into growing the pie for everyone? So with that said, I'm going to shortcut this introduction because I think the left side of the slide needs no explanation to this audience. The right side, though, with this plot where on the y-axis you have the prevalence, or the number of patients in a given disease, and on the x-axis just schematically representing all the different disease, I think actually could use some explanation. And this is where my background is both in biotech as well as now in nonprofit comes together, where there's a keen demarcation around 1,000 patients of when a disease is commercially viable. Beyond that, there becomes very little motivation for a company to work on something, particularly as one of its first few programs. There are, of course, exceptions, but the reality is that if we continue with business as usual with just building biotech companies, there's not going to be treatments for this long tail of ultra rare disease. So I'll give you some examples. I mean, all of those disorders that we talked about with C9orf, with ALS, with Batten disease, they're in this long tail right over here. There are more prevalent rare diseases like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell. Those are the ones that will have treatments. When you actually add up that area under the curve, the AUC of all of these diseases from 12 patients to 300 patients, that's a huge number of people who could potentially benefit from treatments, but just don't have a pathway towards it. So my thesis is that if we're going to address this long tail of ultra rare disease, we need to break the mold of how we do things. There fundamentally need to be more collaborations between patients, academia, and industry, and that's why I'm happy to kick off this section of the IXL's seminars today. So the key question when I was thinking about this is just why now, right? People have been talking about personalized medicines for a long time, yet it feels like there's a dam breaking at the moment. And I think this gets back to the two people that you've heard from earlier today. It's really showcasing the power of programmable medicine. So on the left, you have nusinersen, also known as Spinraza. That's an antisense oligo splice skipping ASO that was approved in 2016. And then you have milasen that was built on the same chemistry, but with, crucially, a reprogrammed different sequence that was designed, made, and dosed all within a single year. There are a significant number of people that helped in this that already seeded this model of the industry academia collaboration. But fundamentally, it showcased the power of these programmable medicines. And then, you have a single example starts to open up this trickle of more. So Tim published this in New England Journal. There was a critical path meeting with the FDA. Out came several draft guidances from the FDA about individualized ASO therapy. And then since then, about 10 to 15 treatments have been developed by many of treatments that many of you guys are familiar with in this room because you have actually contributed to its development. And so this is all based on one technology, that of antisense oligos. And what I hope I can convince you of is that these oligonucleotide programmable technologies, they're going to be the norm rather than the exception in the coming decades. There's going to be a third pillar of medicines after small molecules and monoclonals that really are genetic medicines that are based on targeting nucleic acids. So you'll have things from siRNAs, CRISPRs, in all this different flavors, whether it's nucleases, base editing, prime editing. There's RNA base editing via ADARs, and just every other week it seems like there's more publications about how we can manipulate this exquisite nucleic acid chemistry to target the very genetic source of genetic diseases. So the reason why I think they're so valuable to accelerate these programmable medicines are so valuable to accelerate drug development and the NFU is that you have this opportunity to really stand on each other's shoulders. This bottom of the pyramid is supposed to represent the huge amount of work that happens in industry, hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital funding, things that are really driven by that desire to make the billion-dollar molecule. But what you can learn on that particular molecule are things like, biodistribution, your ADME, safety, immunogenicity, how to make the drug, what's the route of administration. All those things you can learn on an N of many, that then suddenly, when you look at an N of few, you can take all those learnings and accelerate the process of developing these customized, individualized medicines by reprogramming it. The way I'd like to think of it is you're turning a problem that was once hardware development, where you have to strip down the molecule and kind of build it up again, to something that's more software in its nature. So why do we need the learnings? Well, I've articulated that there's this base of the pyramid, and that's really the top part of this schematic I'm drawing, where biopharma really is, when you're building these marketed treatments, you have to learn how to make it, you have to take all that money and make state-of-the-art compounds, the CMC, the tox, just the experience of using those platforms is so valuable to bring to academic centers where the investigators may not be initially an ASO expert, but they can work together with the industry representatives to provide the best and most safe and efficacious treatments to these ultra-rare disease patients. But I also want to draw your attention to the bottom part of this, right? The very fact that it's a platform means that you can actually learn on N of fews things that you might not have tested or even evaluated in a otherwise commercial setting. So what this means is that you can have a company that's operating for about 10 years, and they might have 1-2 treatments just because that's how long it takes to make a new drug. Meanwhile, at academic medical centers, you're constantly varying up small pieces of the sequences. You're building new treatments, and you actually learn more from perturbing that different design space, if you will, with these different treatments, but then can take the learnings and feed them back into making better commercially viable drugs. So here's where I'm really articulating that there is that symbiotic relationship, and we should embrace it rather than kind of think about it as like charity work from one direction to the other. So another thing that I want to emphasize is why even between these N of fews, it's so essential to collaborate. It's not just one person doing this. And it's certainly not just one institution, although there are certainly some leaders here. The reality is that these academic or these current N of one efforts are often led by very motivated families or a dedicated physician scientists and PIs who are just willing to bend over backwards to make something happen. They also sometimes may not talk to each other simply because it's just, this is all so new, right? I think they need to. You need to have the collaboration between the NFUs for several reasons. First is that when you have safety, the concept of a platform is that as you're learning more about the safety parameters, a single safety event, say in trial here, could actually affect the ongoing trials that are here or subsequent trials that have yet to be designed. So that real-time sharing, or as real-time as possible, that sharing of data really protects patients who are just really donating their bodies to these treatments and understanding how they work. The second thing is just about efficiency, right? If we can share data openly for these patients where sometimes, that adage of what it's like, time is neurons, right? Like this is true in neurodegeneration. Some of these children have rapidly progressive diseases where if we are constantly reinventing the wheel, we don't get treatments to them in the time that they need. And then lastly, it's the right thing to do, right? For us to transparently work on these and share learning that honors those patients and families where they literally are volunteering their lives, their time to advancing science. So we have this responsibility to learn all that we can from each patient. So we have Mila, you heard about her earlier. This is a proof of concept. We've seen that it's possible, but it's still in the experimental stage and it's honestly incredibly expensive. Our goal should be as a field that we have children who have orphan genetic diseases, they can receive these bespoke individualized treatments as the standard of care. So in industry, you learn about how do you work backwards from the goal and kind of be very deductive in your thinking. So if we want to find a world in which they're just, the standard of care is this type of individualized medicine, we need to figure out who's going to pay for it. We need to figure out how to scale it. And ultimately, that's also grounded in accessibility and equity. So it's not just the families raising several $1 million who have access to these treatments. Well, to do that, especially for the payment, typically that's gated upon a regulatory body saying, yes, we have evaluated this rigorously, and we have seen the benefit risk is there, and it's approved, or this process is approved, so it's worth paying for. And obviously working backwards a step before, it's how do you rigorously establish the safety and benefit risk? To do that in a heterogeneous field of not just one disease, but many different diseases across different platforms, we really need repeatability, standardization, and sharing of learning. I pose to you that we are still here. We are early in this, and we have an opportunity to do it right and to change the ecosystem together so that we can build towards this future most effectively versus kind of having to reconstruct things in the future. So I mentioned on this last slide, like where we need this repeatability, standard, and learning. And we've thought about the different areas that are, I would say, like self-reinforcing, right? One is thinking through sharing best practices. How do you, and we don't want it to be the Wild West, and there's certain best practices that really are now starting to emerge. How do you share, align, and then ultimately gather good data that's driven by these shared best practices? So if we achieve this, that allows us to reinforce data collection standards that gives you high quality data sets that can inform regulatory or payer thinking. And then here, those data sets could also allow us to improve, right? We can analyze them to say, can we design this better? Could we attract those clinical outcomes better? And we need a space in which we can talk, discuss, and learn across a huge number of different programs. So then we update these best practices based on peer review. Where does this space live, and who's responsible for it? Well, we thought, as being one of the early hubs of individualized medicine, that the N of one collaborative could really serve that purpose for the field, so we can help be this neutral party and an independent body to grow this capability, if you will, for the good of everyone. And this is where I'm just going to briefly talk about what we do. Our mission is to make individualized medicine safe, effectively, and widely available. And the key is as a routine treatment option, not just like, last line. It really becomes this routine option for rare genetic disease. We do this by convening and discussing. We share our learnings. We make sure we're openly sharing our best practices. We're building a database on which we can deposit both preclinical and clinical data to learn and iterate. And then we just simply put, there's value in connecting people, much like you are doing today in that room and online. We think it's so important to be able to do that routinely via us as a hub. And above all of our work is based on rigor, independence, and transparency and inclusiveness. So in the short time that we've been around, we've really had this opportunity to first of all, genetic disease is worldwide, right? So we have participants from around the world. We have over 500 now as our membership in our specific work groups. But we only have 2 full-time employees. Everyone else is a volunteer. And so they're participating with their excess capacity, just like myself, their spare time, because they care so much about this. So we have 65 volunteers spread across these 7 work groups in the bottom. We have 9 signed data sharing agreements. We've published 3 things and more to come. And we have 1 preclinical data partner and 1 prototype clinical database. And again, we do this all to help grow the entire field in individualized medicine. So that's it about the N1C. It's a very small snippet. As I mentioned, this is really a concept talk. And I want to share with you in the last couple of slides where I think this can all go. In particular, just advocating for what I see as a really, it's a new horizon. It's a new specialty called interventional genetics. And why do we choose the name interventional genetics versus, gene therapies or genetic medicines? It's that there's really a precedent for it, and the name matters. So if you look on the left, we can start off with interventional anatomy, right? Like, this is once upon a time people just observing. And then finally, with that knowledge, they're saying, now we can do something about it. Let's actually perform surgery. More recently, you had radiology and other associated internal medicine fields starting off with just observing, but now they have tools that can go in through blood vessels and actually start opening up vessels that are clogged or retrieving clots. That is the intervention that they're doing with what they're able to see. And I pose to you that there's an opportunity in our very near future that, looking at pedigrees, looking at exomes, we're now identifying, just observing the causative mutations. But with all of the technologies that I mentioned earlier, we have a chance to perturb and intervene. So hence the name interventional genetics. And I think this is actually an important thing because this procedural model provides a couple of important precedents. I'll walk through this and I'll share with you why I think that there's important parallels to be drawn for the sustainability of this ecosystem. Take the interventional radiology approach. There's already a set workflow in which a physician determines the exact approach. An industry collaborator or really a vendor, they create the tool. Sometimes you can even have very custom 3D printed N of few tools that are broadly approved by the FDA, but they're still just made by the manufacturers. And then finally, the MD in these interventional cases, they do the intervention and they monitor the follow-up. Every patient is different. Their natural history is different. Their disease course, their anatomy is different. So it's like the N of one, but in anatomical form. So meanwhile, you have on the bottom, the proposed interventional genetics, where similarly an MD, which I propose in the future will be an interventional geneticist, they look at their genetics and their genome. They might be assisted by preclinical design tools. They can choose, is an ASO appropriate? Is a base edit, a prime edit? You name it. And then similarly, an industry partner would create the tool, and they would work with, say, a unique partner like IXL to maybe screen these in a standardized set of assays to establish what are the criteria for here is a genetic medicine that is safe to go into patients. And then finally, the MD, they may not have to understand any of these things that the industry does. They deliver the therapy, they track the outcomes, and they follow up. So it's important to have these precedents because here are some very different things about doing this as a procedure versus doing this as like a clinical trial. First of all, this practice of interventional radiology and procedural work, it's governed by a professional society, something like the N-of-1 Collaborative, place for interventional genetics, hopefully, as well as institutional boards themselves. They're locally and professionally regulated versus by, the FDA. It's very much about treatment with iterative learnings. It's not about doing a clinical trial. It's also not about compassionate use Hail Marys. They're saying, let's try something at the end of a patient's life just because we don't have anything else. You're treating someone, but it's important that you're iterating and those learnings get captured to help the next treatment become better and better. That's how surgeons learn for decades and if not centuries. And then furthermore, the business model exists, right? Industry gets to provide the tools. They might not be making $1 billion in any single given molecule, but what they're doing is getting small amounts of each treatment that's being made. And similarly, the academic medical centers, they're able to bill for all of their practices as well. So I think this is a model that we can build towards if we start from where we are now of saying, let's actually start embracing the ecosystem approach of how can we, how can you today say, let's build this ecosystem. Let's embrace pre-competitive sharing. Can we reset the drug development paradigm, particularly for these NFUs where otherwise we're not going to get there? Can we intentionally have people talk about bias towards action, right? Well, what about a bias towards openness? The default can be sharing, and we kind of radiate that outwards so that we encourage others to do the same. And then, as I mentioned, the N-of-1 Collaborative, we have room, right? There's IXL is already an incredible core sponsor with your early vision. Many thanks to the NWA. But all of you who are listening online, come to our website, email us, and see how you can contribute your expertise, your time, or just pure dollars and cents to help enable individualized medicines. So I leave it here just saying, none of this is impossible today. I think the science has some work to be done, but fundamentally, it's not a gravity problem, as I put it. Many parts are hard. We're going to need to work together, and we're going to need resources. But it just, to me, when you see the possibility of the tools we have, and you see these patients who need them, we owe it to them to connect this together and build this field for these patients who need us. So with that, there's many people to thank, but first and foremost, just want to say, Nyanwei, you and your team at IXL have been a believer in this from the beginning, and just so wholeheartedly throwing yourselves behind this. So thank you, and yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Winston.